Emily holds a Master of Environmental Science degree from the University of Toronto, where she specialized in conservation biology and critical development studies. Her main interest of focus at the Invasive Species Center include prevention and outreach work on spotted lanternfly, facilitating collaboration on invasive species management between municipalities, promoting economic investment in invasive species prevention, and coordinating efforts to address the cumulative impacts of invasive species and climate change. I think this is a very timely topic that we're going to have today, and I am thrilled that she's going to be here to talk to us about invasive species in our garden. So welcome, Emily.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Helen. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. If you'll just give me a moment to get it set up. Just trying to make this nice and big for us. Okay. So, as Helen mentioned, my name is Emily Posteraro. I'm a program development coordinator from the Invasive Species Center, and I'm very pleased to be presenting to you today for Halton Garden Week. So I will start off with a little bit just about the organization that I work for. We are a not-for-profit. Basically, we work to connect stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. We are based out of Sault Ste. Marie. However, we have staff all over the province. I myself am actually speaking to you today from Toronto. And we do work at both a national and provincial scale. So I will start the talk by getting everyone kind of up to snuff on what an invasive species is. And then I will cover invasive species that you might find in the garden or even in a home pond type of setting. And then I will make the case to you to plant native in your garden and talk about reducing pathways of the spread of invasive species and share some resources with you if you want to look into anything a little bit further. So if you tuned into this today, chances are maybe this is a bit of a review for you, but if you're curious and you're not super familiar with invasive species, let's get everyone caught up. So basically, a species is considered invasive when it meets two particular criteria. So as its name probably implies, it's introduced to its ecosystem, so it's from outside of its native range here. And it also has to have impacts or potentially impact the ecology, the economy, or society in its now introduced range. So that means there actually are some species that we consider to be non-native, but not necessarily invasive. To be considered invasive, it does have to meet those two criteria. And often invasive species do have impacts on all three of those things to some extent. There's some somewhat common traits among many invasive species, which kind of help them to be invasive, unfortunately for us. So a lot of the plants and other species I'll talk about today will have a lot of these traits. So many are very fast growing and prolifically reproducing. A lot of them target native species that lack defense mechanisms because the two species did not co-evolve together. Invasive species often lack natural predators. So in their native range, normally there would be kind of a limit imposed on how much they can reproduce and spread due to predators, but they don't have those here. And so they're able to spread. They also have an increased tolerance and adaptive capacity in their new conditions, and that's what's allowing them to thrive. And unfortunately, too, a lot of them do very well in degraded habitats. And so kind of the more we degrade habitat here, the more that just opens up space for species that are highly tolerant of more polluted or degraded environmental conditions. So Ontario has more invasive species than any other Canadian province or territory, and I'll get into why. Southern Ontario in particular has the highest concentration of invasive species, which poses a problem because we do have pretty diverse habitats here, including some that are endangered themselves as a habitat. So for example, the Carolinian forest zone that's in southwestern Ontario, there's just kind of fragments of it left, and that's something we really want to protect. Invasive species are one of the things posing a threat to those kinds of habitats. So, what do the numbers look like? Well, we have 440 invasive plants in Southern Ontario. There's 39 known or potential invasive forest insects. There's 10 different invasive tree diseases, and there is 180 non-native and invasive species in the Great Lakes alone. So it is quite significant. And it's probably not hard to imagine why we're such a mecca for invasive species. You know, we obviously live in a large international trading and travel area. We have the Great Lakes here, so there's a lot of shipping, and we have a very high population density. So that's a lot of people traveling, not just internationally, but also locally, and so that's going to spread invasive species populations even after they initially get here. So due to the scale of this problem, the Invasive Species Act was created to prevent and control the spread of invasive species in Ontario. So there are currently 33 species in the Act, with recent ones that have been added in the last year or so. So 22 of those are prohibited and 11 are restricted. So prohibited is a little a more of a stricter kind of designation. So basically you can't have anything to do with the species. You can't import, possess, transport, or release it. Restricted, it's illegal to bring them into provincial parks or conservation areas or to release them in Ontario. So some examples there that might turn up in the horticultural trade are water soldier and parrot feather, which are prohibited species. And those are fairly recent ones too, I believe. Water soldier was one of the worst culprits, and that one was recently prohibited, which is good. Also, yellow floating heart and the different species of knotweeds have been restricted under the ISA in Ontario. But despite our best efforts in the legislative realm, they do still spread, of course. So one of those ways is naturally. So, you know, you can get natural dispersal through birds, for example, or flooding or just wind dispersal. But we are going to focus more, of course, on the human-mediated methods of dispersal. So for example, through like commercial enterprise, so like any kind of commercial shipping and transport, trucks, construction, those can all spread, you know, invasive species via like seeds or carrying specimens themselves. There's also people's just recreational activities can spread them. So, you know, that graphic is kind of depicting someone spreading seeds on their boots, going hiking. You can also spread it by recreational boating, or certain insects sometimes can hitch a ride on your car. And there's other ways as well. Pets, release of pets, which I'll talk a little bit about, transporting firewood from different places. A lot of insects get transported that way. And the one I have circled there is the horticultural trade, which I will, of course, be talking a little bit more about today. I do want to kind of get across the principle of what we call early detection. So what I have being portrayed on this graph here is basically when a species arrives and then it starts to spread and occupy an increasingly bigger area as time goes on. The cost of dealing with that species also goes up. So when a species, so first you're kind of in the preventative stage, which is when we say you get the best bang for your buck on working to prevent the species. Once it arrives, you know, for a certain period of time, you're at the phase of, you know, you have the potential to eradicate it. it maybe spreads more, you have the potential maybe to contain it. Once it kind of gets past that, you are looking at long-term control and management, which is far, far more expensive. And so we show this to people to kind of get the point home that preventing the spread of invasive species is the most cost-effective to, reducing their overall spread and impacts. So I will talk a little bit about invasive plants in the garden just generally. Some have a more local impact on your garden, while we're going to see that others kind of spread more and have a larger impact across the province. So some of the things that invasive garden plants can do is damage infrastructure. You can see a particularly aggressive plant coming right through the pavement there. A lot of these plants outcompete native vegetation or deter pollinators, or they're just not as good sources for pollinators or for the animals that like feed on those plants. So I don't have it mentioned in the presentation, I don't think, but buckthorn, for example, you'll see birds feeding on those berries, but they're actually not as nutritious for them. So it doesn't necessarily support wildlife in the way that we might think. It can also sometimes harbor invasive pathogens or just other diseases that can impact wildlife. It can take over outdoor spaces and impact our own recreational enjoyment. So you can see a couple pictures there where I think a knotweed has kind of taken over and, kind of taking over the greenery there, compromises the recreational experience a little bit. And then also human health. If you've heard of giant hogweed, it can cause quite severe burns on the skin if you make contact with the plant. And so that definitely poses a problem. So I will go over a number of different species today. It's not going to be an exhaustive list by any means, but hopefully it will just be fairly representative. And I will share lots of resources so that you can look into them further on your own. So within your own garden, invasive plants can spread quickly. You might have already noticed this kind of taking over your other garden plants. They don't contribute to the native ecosystem. So if you're trying to garden with the intent of providing food for birds and pollinators, for example, invasive plants usually don't really fulfill that role or don't do it as well. Becomes difficult to manage and control and therefore poses a cost to homeowners and landowners, and eventually the government if it's something that kind of gets out into public lands, and then it becomes something to deal with. It can inhibit the growth of other plants. So you'll see a term come up in my presentation called allelopathy, which a lot of invasive plants have, and it basically means that they're secreting chemicals into the soil that actually kills or inhibits the growth of other plants. So they're literally kind of outdoing or killing off their own competitors. So you'll see that come up a fair bit, and that dynamic can definitely occur in your own garden. And it can also increase rainwater runoff. A lot of these invasive species don't have as deep taproot systems, and so they're actually not as good at preventing erosion, and we will see some examples of that. So first up, I'm going to talk about Japanese knotweed. So this is a species that is native to Eastern Asia, and it was introduced in North America as a horticultural plant in the late 19th century. We're going to see this emerging as a theme with a lot of these plants. They were brought over as ornamentals many, many years ago, and they are so invasive that they're still with us today. So yeah, it was originally planted as an ornamental and used to stabilize riverbanks and prevent erosion. However, it doesn't do as good of a job as that as native plants that have denser root systems. You can see what it looks like here. It has alternating green-lobed leaves and white-green sprays of flowers, which you might see in late August. And they do have a root system that is deep, and that kind of makes it harder to manage, unfortunately. They don't actually spread so much via seeds as much via rhizomes and its stems. So that's kind of another thing that makes it a little bit hard to manage. You might have seen this referred to as bamboo plants, and that's because the stems are hollow. And this is a species that is now restricted under the Ontario Invasive Species Act. So this species can severely degrade the quality of wetland and riparian habitats where it usually becomes established, creates very dense thickets, and that reduces sunlight by almost 90% in many cases. And it creates these very thick mats. It's basically just crowding out any other plants that are there, and just really degrading the habitat. And it's creating kind of a monoculture. So as a result, when you have a really well established and spreading stand of knotweed, it doesn't support the same levels of native wildlife populations that would normally depend on a number of different plants. It's just kind of creating this really awful monoculture. We do need to further study it, but it is believed that Japanese knotweed might have allelopathic properties. So remember I said that means it's secreting these compounds into the soil that maybe inhibits or prohibits the growth of nearby native species. This one also is quite aggressive at poking through infrastructure and damaging that. And it also interferes with our own recreational enjoyment. It can, kind of block access to water and just make canoeing and boating and fishing and swimming, a lot harder to do in an area where it has taken over. And so you can see in this trail in Sault Ste. Marie, pretty much all these like large flat green leaves that you see here is Japanese knotweed. So it just kind of gives you an idea of how dense those stands can grow, and how it's even starting to kind of encroach on the trail there. Okay, so this is not really an easy one to manage. It only needs like a really tiny little root fragment to reproduce. And manual control, if it's not done right, it might even actually stimulate the growth and increase the density of the plant, which isn't good. It has quite a prolific root system, so reproduces very, very easily. So if you do have a small population, though, which we consider to be less than 15 plants, those control methods can work as long as you're pretty on top of it. So you can do mowing, cutting, digging, and especially if you combine that with putting like a tarp over it, it can be done. However, usually larger populations of it require chemical control. So yeah, this is a more difficult one if you do have it in your yard. So this species is unfortunately present Canada-wide. The primary distribution is in Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces, but there are isolated populations as well in Winnipeg and in southern British Columbia. It's somewhat intolerant of persistent freezing conditions, so it might be more confined to the southern parts of Canada. However, you saw that picture where it was very much present in Sault Ste. Marie. It's been found in Sudbury as well in Thunder Bay. So it is getting fairly far north, and as the climate warms, it might even be able to spread further. We obviously ourselves saw we had a very, very mild winter this year, and so as that kind of thing becomes more common, we might be seeing this plant spread a little further. Okay, I will cover invasive ground covers. So we consider a few different species to kind of fall under that category, and you probably are familiar with these. So these three in particular, goutweed, yellow archangel, and periwinkle, should really be avoided when choosing plants for your garden, as they very quickly escape cultivation and they take over an area if not properly contained. So when they're introduced or they escape into natural areas like forests, they produce very large, dense mats, suppressing other plants on the forest floor. I've seen this a lot myself. I go hiking in conservation areas, and whenever I'm along a trail that is adjacent to private property, I always see stuff like this just crawling right out and getting into our public protected areas. So it rarely ever stays confined to the garden. A lot of nurseries are working to exclude these kinds of invasive plants for sale, but unfortunately they can still be commonly found at some big box garden centers and grocery stores. So it is important to kind of inform people of this stuff. At least you can remain an informed consumer. And there are different ways of managing these different ones, but there are different management plans on the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's website, and we usually cross-post those to our website as well. And so this is a photo from Sault Ste. Marie, so you can really see how this goutweed has just taken right over, and this was because of a yard waste dumping. So that's another thing, and I will mention it again. If you are working on controlling an invasive species in your yard, fantastic, but we do need to make sure that you dispose of it properly. And I will touch on that later towards the end of my presentation. So English ivy is another one. Unfortunately, this one is quite attractive, I think. I think a lot of people like the sight of, ivy growing along a brick wall, but this is an invasive species, and it's extremely vigorous growing evergreen vine. It's commonly used indoors in pots, which is okay as long as disposal is done properly, but outside it can definitely get out of control. It was native to Europe and Western Asia, brought over here again as an ornamental. So this is another one that just causes, grows really like dense mats that can damage infrastructure, can like actually wrap around trees, native trees, and kind of choke them out. And it's also can be toxic if ingested by humans or animals. So it's not a good food plant for wildlife. So you can hand pull and cut this one, which can be effective in late summer and the fall. It does require putting in that kind of effort over the course of a few years, and you do need to bag all plant parts. I will note, though, that this plant can cause rashes for some people when it's handled, so you do want to make sure you're wearing proper gloves and long sleeves and protection, as with really any kind of plant removal, but just noting it especially for this one because some people do have sensitivities to it. Okay, so some people think, I can keep up with it in my own garden. What's the harm? Unfortunately, that usually ends up not being the case. One thing is just that you might not necessarily own your house forever, and so that problem on your property could be passed on to people in the future who don't necessarily have the same green thumb that you do and can't necessarily keep it contained. There's also just the natural dispersal of seeds. Like I said, it's usually hard to control that kind of thing, and I see it all the time in conservation areas where those kind of ground creepers like periwinkle are just getting right in. So there is that to consider. It usually gets into new areas whether you want it to or not. There's also improper disposal of yard waste, or even just seeds get on your own hiking boots when you're working out in the garden, and then you get it into other places. It spreads that way. It's kind of bad even just for your own urban or suburban ecosystem. Can pose a risk to the infrastructure depending on what you're dealing with. And it can even decrease your property value as well. So I'll touch on some other invasive species too. I wanted to bring up jumping worms because I know this is one that was kind of hot in the news last year. And it is an invasive species that is spreading primarily through horticultural trade in mulch, soil, and potted plants. There's also a possibility of their introduction through sale as bait worms. However, we haven't documented this yet in Canada, but still just something to be aware of. So jumping worms, you can see in the top corner there, it's actually referring to a few different species that are native to Asia. They've been here for a long time. They were introduced to the US in the late 1800s. However, they've only recently begun invading the Northeast and Midwest regions of North America. This one, you will be able to recognize it from other species of earthworms in a number of different ways. The jumping worm's skin is smooth, glossy, and rubbery. It's not really slimy or squishy. Feels quite different. They can be 10 to 13 centimeters, and they're called jumping worms because when you disturb them, they thrash wildly back and forth. So some people also call them like snake worms. They're kind of like that. And this is where they earn that nickname, crazy worm, snake worm, jumping worm. They are also parthenogenetic, which means they have asexual reproduction. So they can lay eggs and it doesn't have to be fertilized by a mate for them to reproduce. So that also kind of makes it harder. I have in this slide pointed out the clitellum. So that is kind of a collar band around their bodies, and the color of it is like a cloudy or milky white that is flush with their skin. And so you can also recognize them that way. Now, what these worms do, and this is why it kind of poses a problem for us, is that they're voracious eaters of, kind of the top organic layers of soil in forests. And so they consume it very quickly, taking it away from other wildlife, and it just really degrades soil quality. So this picture here depicts the soil disturbance caused by jumping worms. They also leave behind castings, which is just their waste. But yeah, you can see that organic layer is basically gone. There is more research needed for sure on, how the scale and the kind of range of their impacts and what they could be. Like I said, this is kind of an emerging pest, but definitely still one to worry about and keep an eye out. So yeah, in sum, more research is needed on it, but there isn't large-scale control as of yet. There have been some small-scale control efforts, but yeah, we're basically, we need to be concerned about it because once that kind of thing gets out of control, it probably will be very, very hard to manage. We know in terms of their current distribution, we know there is some in Ontario. There's been sightings in Toronto, Hamilton, and Windsor. Most observations from this past year seem to be from gardens, backyards, and some parks, but they also have been found in urban ravines in Toronto and some semi-natural areas. So this is one that you definitely want to report if you do come across it. You definitely don't need to cancel your, I guess, kind of plant trades or anything like that yet, but we do just want to make people aware of it so you can be aware of it and keep an eye out for it. Okay, so another kind of emerging pest that has been hot on the news in the last year is spotted lanternfly. This is one that I've been fairly involved with at the ISC, doing a lot of awareness raising and outreach and education on it. So this is not strictly a garden pest by any means, but we know that, as gardeners, you're outdoors a lot and very aware of your natural environments. And so good to have your eyes on the ground. So this is what the adults look like. They are kind of pretty, very easily recognizable. Basically, we're worried about this because it is a plant stressor. So they have kind of a long sort of beak that they use to feed on the sap in plants. They have been proven to be quite hard to manage and control. They're spreading rapidly in the United States right now, since they were discovered there in 2014, and they've gotten as close as Buffalo, New York. So, probably kind of a matter of time before they get here, although we are trying to implement preventative measures. These guys are a really high concern for vineyards. They do seem to really like grapes in particular, or grapevines, I should say. They don't really feed on the fruit itself. But yeah, they tend to be present in vineyards and tender fruit orchards, but also street trees, especially when we plant street trees as saplings. They have been known to outright kill saplings of a number of different species. So poses a big problem there. And they feed on over 100 different plant species, possibly more that we don't know about yet. And they have a strong preference for a widespread invasive plant, which is tree of heaven, which you might have yourself in your own yards. It has been spreading here since the 17th century. We don't necessarily care if it kills that particular tree since it's invasive itself, but because that tree is so widespread, it means a spotted lanternfly could very easily establish here. And they can also be spread by being transferred on ornamental plants. So Michigan, I believe, had their first detection maybe last year or the year before. And that was because just a concerned citizen found the spotted lanternfly nymphs at a nursery and they reported it. So they can lay their eggs on almost any hard surface. And they themselves, as adults and as nymphs, can travel very easily, like hitchhike on equipment and vehicles and whatnot. So they can definitely be spread very easily through that trade. I can't go as deeply into them as I'd like to, but I would definitely encourage everyone to learn to recognize them at all phases of their life, especially as eggs. They can be kind of cryptic. You can see in that first picture there, it's just kind of muddy looking, really. But eggs can be transported very easily. So we don't have any confirmed sightings of those here yet, thankfully, but if you do think you see one, please report it to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Okay, so I don't know if we have any pond owners here, but I did want to just kind of touch on a couple of aquatic pets, since those are also invasive species in many cases. So the motto for pets is don't let it loose. And that's because it can pose a pretty big problem. It actually is illegal to release non-native animals into the wild anyway, but unfortunately enforcing that kind of thing is pretty difficult. And so it does happen regularly. So pets like turtles, fish, snails, and crayfish, when they're released, they can introduce disease and also compete with native wildlife species. I've pulled a couple of just recent news headlines here. I've pictured there on the left a red-eared slider turtle. You might have seen them before, but they're not native, they're invasive. So this is a turtle that will compete with our native turtle species and potentially introduce diseases, bring salmonella, things of that nature into the environment. Important to note that in Ontario, every single one of our native turtle species is on the species at risk list. So they're all vulnerable or threatened or endangered to some extent. And so this red-eared slider would be posing a threat to our already vulnerable native turtles. Another common one, you can see that headline there from Quebec about goldfish, which you think might be just a harmless little fish, but similarly, they can introduce disease and compete with native fish species, and they can also grow really, really big. So this was a pretty recent headline from France. People think goldfish are always tiny, but that's only because we usually put them in tiny tanks and fish bowls. Once they are released, there's no limit on what size they can get, really, and so they can get huge. So you can imagine that a fish of that size may be posing some competition and some problems to the native fish populations. So if you are someone who stewards a pond at home or an aquarium, that's fine. We just recommend, do your research before buying. We have a checklist on our website if you're looking to get a new pet. Just to kind of ask yourself, like, do you know about what care it requires? Are you prepared to provide that care? A lot of people, especially with like something like turtles, they'll buy one. They think it's like cute and small and easy to take care of, and then it gets bigger and lives a really long time, and they realize they're not prepared to take care of that. And that's why people do release those kinds of pets, unfortunately. If you are in this situation and you no longer want a pet like this, definitely don't release it. Please try to rehome it. There's a number of options. You could donate it to a school or an educational facility that might need it. Sometimes you can even contact the retailer and they can do something about it. So definitely look into your options. And don't flush dead fish down the toilet. Even though it's dead, it can still spread disease, cause a problem. You're better off burying it. Okay, and then you might have some aquatic plants as well. A lot of these are ones that were recently put on the Ontario Invasive Species Act as being prohibited or restricted, sorry. So water soldier was like one of the worst ones. However, there are only a couple of known locations in Ontario. One is in the Trent Severn waterway, and one is in Red Horse Lake. There's also been, I think, a smattering of sightings in private ponds where it was purposefully brought. And those ponds are landlocked. However, if there's a flooding event, it can carry fragments of the water soldier, and then it can spread that way. So this is an example of a species that, it wasn't spreading super far yet. We knew it was going to be bad. And so it got prohibited under the act, which was a good proactive measure to do. There's also yellow floating heart. That is a perennial aquatic plant that was introduced to North America in the late 19th century. As is the theme today, it was brought over as an ornamental, and then accidental and intentional releases and flooding have led to its dispersal in other waterways, and that one is now restricted. There's also parrot feather, another one introduced as an ornamental in around 1890. That got out too. Water chestnut was introduced to North America sometime before 1879 by a gardener at the Cambridge Botanical Garden in Massachusetts. And then that got out to several ponds, and it's been spreading ever since. Flowering rush is another one that was first recorded along the shores of the St. Lawrence in Montreal in 1897, and it's quite quickly spread into the Great Lakes and is now found in all provinces in Canada and much of the northern United States as well. This one was probably introduced through ballast water. So I mentioned, since Ontario is kind of a big trade and shipping hub, we bring in a lot of invasives that way, but also was brought in as an ornamental. And then there's also frogbit. So that was brought over from Europe to an experimental farm in Ottawa, and it escaped into the Rideau Canal in 1939, and now that is widespread as well. Most of these plants, the aquatic ones in particular, can reproduce by fragmentation. So that's when, just like a little piece breaks off and floats somewhere down the river, and then it can kind of root again. And so they spread very easily, similarly to how those some of those terrestrial plants have impacts on terrestrial ecosystems. These ones also form like these very dense mats in the water. So that impacts boating, it impacts the wildlife in the water. It'll like literally block out sunlight. And as those plants die and decompose too, it creates what we call an anoxic environment. So it's like literally depriving the water of oxygen that the fishes and other life in the water needs. So these ones are pretty significant problems. So you might be wondering, well, what can I plant in my garden? And we try to promote planting native plants. So your garden can have an impact on the community and on biodiversity. We hope that you will make it a positive one. And so you can see a few specimens in this kind of graphic here, things like wild roses, black-eyed Susan, wild geranium. These are great things to plant that will actually support native wildlife. So we try to promote the idea that native gardens are beautiful. These aren't just, ugly weeds. They're encouraging biodiversity and ecosystem health. They're providing food and shelter for butterflies and other insects, birds and mammals, since these are the species they all co-evolved with, so they're going to like these ones better. Also, since they're native, they are theoretically much lower maintenance. They're adapted to this environment, and therefore like resilient to our local climate and predators and disease. And that should also reduce the need for pesticides. Whoops, sorry, let me get back to our slide here. There we go. There are lots of options. I definitely won't go through a whole list of alternatives, but there is, for example, the Grow Me Instead guide, which was developed by the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, and that can help you determine which native species to plant in place of invasive plants that are still found, unfortunately, in garden centers. So there's tons of alternatives here. And you can look at it by type of plant too. If you're like, I kind of like the look of English ivy, but I would like a native alternative. There's some native alternatives listed there that you could try and source. So like I said, it is challenging to regulate this kind of thing. We're definitely making progress, and like I said, there's been a number of species that have been recently regulated under the Invasive Species Act. However, a lot of action can also take place, at the consumer level when you put pressure on some of these businesses. So one thing you can do, for example, is ask your local nurseries if they have pledged to the National Voluntary Code of Conduct, which is a whole kind of guide or manual for retailers. And one of those kind of requirements for them is that they properly label and separate invasive and native plants so that consumers are aware of what they're buying. And otherwise, there's a lot of other things that you can do. You can reduce the pathways of spread. So, if you're working in your garden and there are invasive plants there, ideally you should clean your boots and outdoor gear. Many conservation areas and parks now have boot brush stations at the entrances of trails. So please make use of those. They're there for a reason, so that you can kind of reduce spreading seeds. As I've mentioned, choose native species in your garden. There's lots of resources for that. Buy your firewood locally and burn it locally. This one prevents a lot of different forest pests, in particular, a lot of insects. I don't know if there's some crossover in this audience maybe with boaters, but we do like to promote not dumping your bait into water because a lot of invasive species can spread that way. I mentioned that I would touch on properly disposing of invasive plant matter if you are choosing to manage something that's growing in your yard. Definitely always wear gloves when removing invasive plants. That's really more for your sake than anything. Like I said, a lot of these can be kind of irritating to the skin. You want to place all plant parts in ideally construction grade garbage bags. I've used big black garbage bags myself in the past. And then you can leave it on a hard surface in the sun for at least a week. That'll kind of like kill everything in there. And then you want to dispose it with normal trash. Definitely do not put it in like a home compost or dump it in like a ravine that you back onto, because like I said, a lot of these plants spread through just fragments, and you could actually be helping it to spread. Having said all that, different areas could have different disposal requirements, so make sure you consult the best management practices for the species and whatever waste disposal is required for your area. And this is just an example of, if you don't dispose something properly, it can start to maybe even creep into your neighbor's yard there. So reporting is something we like to encourage people to do. It's one of the easiest, cost-effective things that you can do to help. There's a number of different tools. This one is probably one of the best ones. This is, we call it EDMAPS, which stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. So it's very easy to report invasive species directly in an app on your smartphone, or you can make notes and then do it later on your computer. But this is something that is actually, all the reports are actually vetted by experts, so it doesn't just go into the internet ether. People will see it, and it's actually used to produce like distribution maps that scientists can use. So a lot of the maps that I have been showing you on this presentation are from EdMaps, and those are from citizen science reports. So it actually is quite helpful. There are some other ways to report in Ontario. There is an Ontario Invading Species Hotline. There's also the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So for plants that are like kind of widespread, you maybe wouldn't necessarily call one of those numbers for every instance of, garlic mustard, let's say. But something that is kind of an up and coming pest like jumping worm or spotted lanternfly, would definitely recommend reporting directly to one of these agencies. You can also, for more information, you can visit our website and sign up for bi-weekly media research and event scans. So other events that we're doing, you'll get them right into your inbox. We also release a quarterly newsletter and webinar invitations. We do have a monthly webinar series if you're interested in learning more. That is invasivespeciescenter.ca. There are species profiles for many of the species that I talked about today and more. And you'll find all kinds of fact sheets, technical bulletins, best management practices, and resources on those species profiles. So please check that out. And we also have databases that are searchable on our website. So you can go straight to our best management practices database, look up something that you're looking to manage, and then it'll come up for you. We have lots of videos on our YouTube channel as well. We recently had our annual Invasive Species Center Forum. All those videos are now up on our website. Past webinars are on there. So if you like to learn that way, you can check that out as well. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for listening to my presentation today. Again, my name is Emily. I am here to answer any questions that you might have, or you can feel free to email me with additional questions at eposteraro@invasivespeciescenter.ca. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was great. We do have a number of questions. If you do have a question, please put it either in the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, or the chat, which again is just another function at the bottom of your screen. Just press that and the chat will come up at the side. So to start with, going back to the Japanese knotweed, can we legally use a herbicide to control this? So perhaps using the technique where you cut it down and pour the pesticide into the stem. And I think they're asking this also because we learned in the previous talk that, there's that cosmetic pesticide ban or herbicide ban. So are we still allowed to use that for something where it's invasive species?
I am not sure what products are legal for Japanese knotweed. I know there's also like certain herbicides or pesticides where you have to have a license to apply it. So, we do use herbicides sometimes to manage certain invasive species, but it's like, conservation authorities that have licensed staff that do that. So for that particular one, I don't know. But if you do want, and I'll maybe put my email address in the chat when I can, you can email me and I can check back in with the Invasive Species Center and see if we can get a good answer for you.
We have another question. Somebody added goldfish to their landlocked urban pond to help control mosquitoes. Is this a problem? And if it is, are there alternatives for mosquito control?
That's a good question. I would say the concern with landlocked ponds could be flooding. But I think that's more of a concern, to my understanding, for aquatic invasive plants, just because of fragments of that can reproduce very easily. I'm not sure how likely it is that goldfish could get out. I know birds eat them. Herons will eat goldfish all the time. I actually am not sure if that's bad for the herons. Generally speaking, like, my personal philosophy is like I would probably avoid like buying invasive species for that kind of thing. But yeah, I get that for, you know, mosquito control. I mean, that's a public health issue too, right? I'm not sure what good alternatives are there for that. Like, I don't know if those, you know, citronella candles or other things of that nature, how effective they actually are. I do think a goldfish in a landlocked pond is probably lower on the risk of harm to the environment, but definitely make sure, you know, you're disposing of that properly when and if it dies, right? Like I said, you don't want to release it or flush it down the toilet or anything like that. So I would just kind of be aware of that.
I think the biggest thing is keeping your water moving if you can, with like a waterfall or one of those fountain sprays. That usually prevents mosquitoes from laying their larvae in the first place. Or
That too, yeah.
right. And then another thing we found that works for mosquitoes in the pond, frogs, because the tadpoles eventually eat the larvae, I believe. So anything you can encourage the frogs and toads to live around your pond. Depends how big your pond is, I'll admit that. And there are mosquito dunks as well, which I've used. Usually those are pretty, Halton Master Gardeners is adding that to the comment section. Mosquito dunks, you can get those at garden centers. You just toss them in. They're, the substances are pretty benign to the environment, but will kill the mosquito larvae.
That's great. I didn't know that myself, so.
Can your slides be used for spreading the word on social media with credit, of course? I think that's probably a question best emailed directly to Emily, if possible, unless you want to comment on that now.
Yeah, I don't think we usually share like entire slide decks, but Invasive Species Center is on all the different social media platforms. So whichever one you use, you're definitely encouraged to share our posts, and we post about many different invasives on a daily basis. So,
in fact, right now is Invasive Species Awareness Week. And I know for our website or our social media at Halton Food, we have been using their social media kit, which has posts. So they're ready to go. So you can just use the images and their wording to send out the message on your social media. So, so when one uses the EDD Maps app to report a sighting, is there any subsequent follow-up with the reporting person? So they follow up with the question, could a person reporting it be responsible for additional follow-up?
yeah, this is a good question, and I'm glad someone brought it forward, because I think there is often some confusion on what happens when you report. So I guess the short answer is no. There isn't like a follow-up. Unfortunately, if you report like an invasive plant, there isn't necessarily like a task force that kind of shows up and and you know deals with it. However, it's important for a different reason, and it's because we don't necessarily always have a solid idea of how these different species are distributed. And so having people, you know, submit their reports and then that being put on a map, that ends up being a really good resource for land managers and even scientists doing research. It's really helpful for that. I will note that the exception is that, oh, someone has received follow-up requests. Okay, yes. So there is that where if they want like a better picture, sometimes whoever is the, I forget what they call it, but kind of like the moderator or whatever for that area, or the representative for that area could get in touch with you for that, depending on what it is. If you were to report something like spotted lanternfly, like something that hasn't been reported before or is like an emerging pest, you would get someone from CFIA, you know, probably asking you for some kind of confirmation, or if you have photos or anything like that.
That makes sense. Someone did comment in the chat that they did report buckthorn to the city, but nothing was done. So they were just told it's, yeah, there's a lot of it growing over the parks. So
yeah, unfortunately, some of these things are, you know, a little out of control. And, you know, municipalities and conservation authorities manage what they can. But yeah, sometimes it's just like they know it's there and they're either getting to it or they don't have the capacity to get to it.
Yeah, it's a disappointing response. I agree.
I know.
Okay, so we do have, all right, so we have some specific questions, but there's one, does burning knotweed kill it?
Oh, that I'm not sure. I would have to, if you want to email me on that one, I can double check and find out. I didn't see it on the list of management options, so probably that might be a bad idea. Especially too, if you're, I mean, depending on how you're doing it, like it might still kind of leave like roots or whatnot in the soil, but I can double check that one.
All right, so, sorry, this one here about how to, comment on pokeweed and wild grape and their invasiveness. If you could comment on those two.
Oh, pokeweed and wild grape. I don't know about those ones. It might be on our website, but I'm not sure.
So how do you get rid of periwinkle, get wheat, and how to identify and get rid of a dandelion type flower on a taller plant that spreads with thick rhizomes? So if anybody knows what that one is, please put it in the chat if they can identify a dandelion type flower on a taller plant that spreads with thick rhizomes. I will think about that one, but otherwise, in the meantime, how do you get rid of periwinkle and goutweed?
Those ones I'm not sure, but we do, like, for sure we have the best management practices. They're like management guides basically for those on our website. And those are produced by Ontario Invasive Plant Council. So that will kind of walk you through like exactly when and how to manage those things. But I don't know off the top of my head.
All right. Any further questions? Well, thank you again for joining us. This was really good. Do you find, I guess with climate change, is the problem getting worse?
We expect it to get worse, yes. And there's definitely insects too that we would probably expect, that Canadian winters would normally have prevented them from establishing here. Like the eggs just wouldn't be able to overwinter. But as we're getting these milder winters, that's probably not going to be the case going forward. And so for that kind of thing, for sure, we expect it to get worse. And invasive species too can exacerbate like the effects of climate change. So if you have something like emerald ash borer that just wiped out ash trees, cities used ash trees for street trees, so now you don't have that shade and evapotranspiration taking place, and so it just becomes this kind of really unfortunate feedback loop.
I'm beginning to think that dandelion type flower on a taller plant might be Jerusalem artichoke. Google Jerusalem artichoke and then get back to us if you think that might be it, which is actually a native plant, but it does spread like crazy. So it gets into farmers' fields and they don't love it. But thank you again for joining us, Emily. This has been really informative and really great, and it's really good to spread the word, especially during this Invasive Species Awareness Week. It is a good time to spread this word. Literally spread this word.
Yeah, spread the word, not invasive species.
And please join us tonight at 7 o'clock. We'll have Lorraine Johnson with the incredible edible pollinator garden and learn all about how to have the best garden ever without invasive species.
Okay, thank you so much everyone for having me, and my email address is in the chat, so if you do want to follow up with anything, please feel free.
All right, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, bye now.